Welcome to Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Thanks for joining us. As the island's primary acute healthcare facility, our hospital remains an essential component in the lives of our people. This sentiment isn't lost on Sir Henry, as it is here where he worked for many years to the benefit of his fellow Barbadians. In this episode, Sir Henry reflects on his many roles at our hospital, the challenges endured, and of course, those wonderful success stories.
The hospital, of course, was a very special place. It had been built in 1964. It had been conceptualized in 1948. And there was a royal commission in the good old colonial days to decide what to do about the development of a modern hospital in Barbados. Remember, the old General Hospital was built in 1840, opened in 1841 as a public-private partnership. And that's worth mentioning because public-private partnerships can often work. And the General Hospital of Barbados was an excellent example of a public-private partnership where the private sector raised money, the government put money, and it basically catered for the poorer people. There was no real hospital for special privileges with private rooms for the wealthy. The wealthy had to be dealt with in their own homes. If they had to have an operation, it was often done on the kitchen table or in their bed, you know. But the General Hospital was a good example. But by 1948, it was 107 years old. And the Royal Commission was published. Their report was published in the Barbados Advocate in a 2-page spread of this big newspaper in the good old days of a broadsheet. And what they were recommending on the basis of the Barbadian population of, at that time, 240,000, was a hospital with 250 beds. And the rather naive consultants who came and saw Barbados said, well, that's the number of beds that cater to a peripheral hospital in Britain with a population of 250,000. What they didn't appreciate is that those hospitals in Britain had interspersed the big teaching hospitals with many more beds in each of the cities. We didn't have that. And it was obviously nonsense. And when the hospital was finally designed, luckily the chief medical officer at the time and the other doctors involved in the planning decided that what we needed was a hospital with 500 beds. So we had a hospital twice the size of the original planning, and it was opened in 1964. But it was designed only with something like 13 consultants, I think, minimal staff, and it was not really up to speed in 64. So things were not really that good when I came. Now, I had done a neurology residency as well as my pharmacology in London and gastroenterology as well. And I brought back some of my own equipment that was needed for gastroenterology. And my neurology training had taught me of the huge value of rehabilitation therapy. People who could hardly walk, people who couldn't do much with their hands, for example, with appropriate training, skills and support in a rehab therapy department, they could have a life again. And I spent several years badgering the hospital for a rehab therapy department. And do you know how it came about? It came about because Sir Branford Tate, and it's perfectly in order for me to say this, he was very happy for me to talk about it. Sir Branford Tate developed a back problem, and he came to the hospital for physiotherapy treatment. And at the time we had a physiotherapy department in which the rehab pool was used for storage. There was no water, there was no aquatherapy, and there were just 4 physiotherapists. That was the department, and a secretary who took the phone calls. And Sir Branford spoke to the hospital director because the head of physiotherapy, Ms. Ezra Hall, told him of her problems. So the hospital director came down and chatted with then Mr. Tate, and Mr. Tate was told that there was a guy on staff called Henry Fraser who was passionate about rehab therapy. So I was sent for, I was summoned, and I went down from my office to speak to Mr. Tate, and we talked about the needs and everything. And he said to me, Doc, if you will find out, plan, discuss and decide what we need for a proper rehabilitation therapy department, I will ensure that you get it. Well, I happen to know of a physiatrist. That's a person who specializes, a doctor specializing in rehab therapy in New York. And the hospital agreed to bring her down for a consultancy for a week. She spent a week here. She spent time talking to all of the consultants in the hospital, to the physiotherapy department itself, to the physiotherapists outside of the hospital, and visited all the polyclinics. And she wrote me a report, more than 2 pages, I think it was 6 pages, of all of the needs for a good rehab therapy in the hospital. And do you know, we got expansion of staff, we got the appointment of a rehab therapist, which we had not had, and a rehab therapist assistant. We got a larger role for prosthetics, we got equipment, and we got an agreement that we would have a physiatrist to run this department. That's a doctor specially trained with full postgraduate training in North America. Meanwhile, of course, Muggins volunteers for so many things, so Muggins gets lots more jobs. So I was asked, therefore, to head up this expanding rehabilitation therapy when I had no formal training in rehabilitation therapy. But it was a very satisfying result. I did that for 2 years, and then I passed the job to Dr. David Corbin, the neurologist that we had been able to bring back to Barbados for 2 years. And then finally the physiatrist, young Dr. Harley Mosley III, took over as the physiatrist. So that is one of the wonderful success stories of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. One of the other challenges that I faced was that high blood pressure was obviously a major problem at the time. And patients were being admitted to the hospital in my internship period and when I first came back with what we call malignant or accelerated hypertension, the severe hypertension that causes a stroke. And sometimes people don't even know that they have high blood pressure because, as you know, you probably know, Barbadian men are not good at attending the doctor. They're always afraid of what might happen and they prefer not to know. So many people have high blood pressure, don't know about it, never get treated, and the blood pressure goes up and up and up. And the accelerated hypertension is relatively easy to diagnose. It's very high values of a systolic value when the heart is pumping of more than 200 and a diastolic value of way over 100. That's when the heart is relaxing. And you can tell it by looking at the eyes and so on, which is something that many doctors don't want to do because it takes time. But we were seeing a lot of very severe high blood pressure, and I decided something had to be done. And so I started a hypertension clinic. And again, that was one of the satisfying things that I did, creating that hypertension clinic. And Dr. Nicholson subsequently joined me in it, and we did some drug trials in that hypertension clinic. And I had the benefit for a year of Dr. Anne Bailey. Now, Dr. Anne Bailey was the brilliant daughter of Dr. Harry Bailey, the founder of the diagnostic clinic. Anne was brilliant, and she was not in medicine for the money. So what she did was to work in the mornings while raising her family in the emergency department. And she was seeing most of the people with high blood pressure and diabetes. So an agreement was made that 1 day a week she would come to my hypertension clinic and work with me. And then sadly she developed pancreatic cancer and died. But the hypertension clinic was a great success. And one of our graduates, of whom I'm very proud, Dr. Mansour from Antigua, Dr. George Mansour, he became a hypertension specialist working out of Connecticut, and we remained in close contact. So when I decided that we had to have an ambulatory blood pressure service at the hospital, and I could not get the hospital's budget approved by the ministry to provide the equipment for measuring blood pressure on the go. This is called ambulatory, when you wear a cuff and pressure is taken every 15 minutes in the day, every 30 minutes at night while you're sleeping, and you get a picture of what happens to the blood pressure. And we couldn't get the hospital's budget approved for that equipment. And Dr. Mansour brought me my first set of equipment. And I expanded it. I got further equipment through the Faculty of Medicine's research budget, because the hospital's budget was constantly suppressed by the Ministry of Finance. And we set up that ambulatory blood pressure service, and I had a brilliant technician, Rosalind King, who assisted me in running it and in analyzing the tapes and so on at the end of the day. So that's one of the things that we developed. The other thing that I developed for the hospital was what we call therapeutic drug monitoring. Epilepsy is a very serious problem. It occurs in between 1 and 2% of most populations. And in places like Barbados, where in the early days, before the QEH and the consultant obstetrician appointments at the QEH, our obstetric care was not all that good. Systematic antenatal care was not carried out enough, and patients often presented with delivery who had not had antenatal care. This often meant that the infant suffered. The infant would suffer birth trauma. The infant would get brain damage. And as a result, we had a fairly high prevalence of epilepsy. And both doctors and civilians tend to be afraid of epilepsy. They tend to not know what to do when a patient has a seizure. Doctors were often in Barbados, when I came home, still managing epilepsy with the drugs of the 60s. Now, to manage epilepsy carefully requires the use of modern technology, where the drugs that are given can be actually measured in the blood so that you get the concentration right. You can understand this very easily. For example, people who have one drink of alcohol may not notice any difference in how they feel, but by the time they've had the second drink, they feel relaxed, and perhaps they start being more frank and open. They may tell some good jokes and so on. By the time they've had their third drink, they may be becoming very happy, and if they have 4 or 5 in too short a time, then you know what happens, and they're a danger on the road. So the same thing occurs with drugs which affect the nervous system, and therefore too small a dose of an anti-epileptic drug doesn't work, and too big a dose of an anti-epileptic drug will make people drowsy and again perhaps dangerous on the road. So the approach has been to measure the drugs used in epilepsy, used in heart conditions, and so on. And to do this required equipment. In the old days, the chemistry laboratory didn't have that kind of equipment. So I actually made a special trip to Palo Alto to see the manufacturers of the equipment, and I got a gift of the equipment just to promote the fact that that equipment could be used for such an important service. I got a gift of equipment for my laboratory, which I set up in the basement of the hospital. And I was able, by setting up this therapeutic drug monitoring service, to tremendously improve the management of our epilepsy patients in the hospital. It made a tremendous difference, and it was very satisfying. 10 years later, the laboratory expanded its equipment, improved its equipment, and the modern chemical laboratory equipment can measure drug levels. So I was able to close down that particular laboratory service. But that was one of the many things that we did at the hospital that I really enjoy doing. The hospital role, though, was very, very much multitasking. And the problem we had was not only a lack of specialists, but a lack of junior staff in training positions. There was no training when I came home. Professor Waldron was very keen, as dean, to expand and develop postgraduate training, because people had worked in a kind of junior doctor arrangement, and maybe they would go off to Edinburgh for an attachment and learn some surgery and that sort of thing. They were training under Professor Waldron, but not in a formal way. So he and I worked very hard to develop the postgraduate training program, and I'm happy to say that when Dr. Nicholson and then Dr. Edwards came back to Barbados, that they were very keen on this, and Dr. Edwards was the person who really promoted and managed the postgraduate training. We had first postgraduate training in ophthalmology with a diploma, which Professor Sir Errol Waldron started, and then we had postgraduate training in internal medicine. And I always boast about the first graduate of that program was Dr. Irving Branker. And Professor Waldron then put him, when he qualified, to develop a modern emergency department, which had been, again, running on 1960 standards, and we were now into the 1980s. So postgraduate training was something that we got great satisfaction out of doing, so that in the major specialties, surgery, medicine, obstetrics, pediatrics, we were able to develop a full formal residency program and to train our own doctors so that we did not have to import doctors from India or England to do the jobs that we should have been training people to do. And that has been a great success story, our postgraduate training at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital over the last 25 to 30 years. And then there was the role that I undertook for Professor Walron of continuing medical education. Doctors graduate, and that's really the beginning of their learning experience. Sir William Osler, the great modern day, early 20th century guru, the modern Hippocrates, as many people would say. Sir William Osler, the great Canadian-born physician, who was mentored by a Barbadian doctor. Sir William Osler always said that experience teaches you to do things, hopefully, wisely, and not just to do things, something like that. And so it was terribly important for us in Barbados to do something about the fact that our doctors graduated and most doctors didn't do anything further about postgraduate training, about further training, about renewing their training. And there were a few who would go off to a conference here or there every few years, but we decided to develop a program of continuing medical education, and we tried to follow what was happening in most Western countries, Britain, Canada, North America, that people should be registered with this postgraduate medical training in order to continue practicing. But we ran programs, and I ran these programs for 11 years with the help of Dr. Hoyos. Michael Hoyos was the assistant coordinator. And we would put on 2 days of medical training twice a year in Barbados, and then we expanded it in alternate years to Antigua or St. Vincent, and we ran those Caribbean programs, and it was quite satisfying. But we spent 20 years trying to persuade the Medical Council to make it essential that doctors should attend them. And of course, like in all things, just like in vaccination for COVID, you have those who are willing to do the sensible and the right thing, and those who simply will not. You know, it's not their thing, you know. I remember a doctor who subsequently developed Alzheimer's, who once said at a conference that was put on by the drug companies that he had qualified in 1936, he'd never gone to any further training, and as far as he was concerned, in 1969, he was still practicing perfectly good medicine, 33 years later. So those were the kinds of attitudes that one was sometimes dealing with, and I'm happy to say that in the very year of my retirement, it turned out that the Medical Council approved mandatory continuing medical education, and it is now a requirement for doctors to re-register. So that was one of our success stories. One of the problems at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital was the sense of development that the doctors had and the sense of status quo that the authorities had. Now, we have to go back to 1964 when the Queen Elizabeth Hospital opened. The then Minister of Health was Dr. Ramesses Cattle, who said the hospital did not need a board. It could function perfectly well reporting to the minister. So from 1964 until 2004, 40 years, the hospital had no board. The director reported to the minister. Now, this created a serious problem because the doctors at the hospital would have ideas or concerns or challenges or needs. They would report it to the hospital director would put it to the minister, and the minister probably said, well, is this going to increase the votes I get in my constituency? And if he didn't have a convincing argument for that, then he would not put it forward to the Minister of Finance for approval. And so civil servants, it is often said, their experience and their training and their job requirements is to find ways of not spending money, to keep the budget just where it is and do nothing that will improve costs. The doctors, of course, those who have vision, those who have specialty training, those who see needs of equipment and other staff, will want to see a very different course for the hospital. They want to see development. They want to see the patients being able to be given the modern treatment. They want to see them being able to get the modern drugs, you see. So this was a question now of stability, status quo, versus vision and development. And the Bible has said that where there is no vision, the people perish. And that is quite literally the case in medical care in Barbados, because where there was no vision, people were perishing. And so we, in the medical team, we had to work very hard. We would first identify a person who could fill a particular need, and then we had to negotiate with the Ministry of Health to have that person funded. And we had a whole series of consultant specialty posts created in the Department of Medicine. We had first the post of neurologist, Dr. David Corbin, who is the son of a very distinguished Barbadian civil servant in the Foreign Ministry. He had worked in London, his father. David had trained at Bristol, and David came out to do a year post-internship, and I was fortunate to have him as a junior doctor working on my team. And I recognized immediately that David was a guy who was not just an ordinary average guy. David was a guy with special skills and what I call stick-with-itness. And at the time that he was working with me, we were having a whole flood of patients, pun intended, a flood of patients with near drowning. These were largely people who had had too much to drink and gone into the sea and drowned, the odd person with epilepsy, and the odd person who just couldn't swim, and a current had carried him off, as has been happening recently at the hot pot. And David and I produced a paper on 100 cases of near drowning. And his thoroughness and his conscientiousness and his ability to write made Professor Hassel, who was head of the department, and I realized, here is a guy that we need. And we said, now we have various roles that we need. We need a neurologist, we need an endocrinologist, we need a rheumatologist. Which of these specialties do you like the most, David? And David said he liked neurology. So we said, right, we will promote your training. I wrote letters of recommendation. David worked at Hammersmith Hospital and the Institute of Neurology where I had worked. He got his training in Britain and he came back, and we persuaded the government to create a full-time consultant post in neurology for David. A similar thing happened with Dr. Timothy Roach, who was interested in respiratory medicine. Now, we had tuberculosis, admittedly on the wane, but we had asthma, which was becoming endemic and epidemic across the country, a whole lot of asthma, and many other conditions. And so, again, we made the case to the Ministry of Health, we need a chest physician. Here's a young doctor who is interested in it. So he was able to get support to go back to Britain, to the chest hospital, get his training in chest medicine, and return. And we continued that process. We identified someone for rheumatology, and Dr. Cindy Flower, who is a brilliant student, honors graduate. She went off to the Cleveland Clinic. She came back as a rheumatologist. So we did this, demonstrating that there was vision in the department, but we had to work very hard to get the hospital to approve all of these recommendations. The hospital has had a very hard time working in the area of cardiology, because the plans for cardiology were made and not followed through. They were made and not followed through. They were made and government wouldn't do what they were advised and asked and requested and cajoled and begged to do. So cardiology, which was the #1 subspecialty that should have been developed to the hilt, took a very long time to get underway. But it was a challenge always for us, working with the government and with the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy can be almost like trying to move stones. Very, very, very difficult to work with. But we have had, I'm happy to say, some success stories. One of the biggest problems was the issue of drug supplies. When I came home, we had a tradition where, although there were only a small number of consultants, many of the doctors had their own personal choices, which meant that we sometimes had 5 drugs that did the same thing, because 5 different doctors wanted to use 5 different drugs. And this didn't make a lot of sense. I had had training and experience in the area of essential drugs, which is what the World Health Organization had promoted. And so the PAHO had asked the hospital to develop a drug and therapeutics committee, which Dr. Bertie Graham had started the very year that I came home. So within a few months, he could pass the buck to me, since I had the training, and we developed our own hospital drug committee, and then a national drug committee resulted from the development of the Barbados Drug Service. Barbadians who are old enough will recall that back in the era of 1976, the government of the day decided we would have a national health service like the British, and a very naive calculation suggesting that 50 GPs could work 24/7, 52 weeks of the year at a certain salary. It would only cost the government a few $1 million and we could have a national health service. Well, the concept was inappropriate because it had not been worked through. And the Medical Association of the day, in its discussions and debates with the government, finally had to unionize to form the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners. And out of all of those debates, what the government recognized that they should do is to accept that Barbados would have a dual healthcare system. There would continue to be patients operating with their private doctors and a government service which would provide primary care as well as tertiary care free of charge for those who wanted it. And this was a pretty sensible mix, but out of it all came a proposal for a drug service because it was recognized that drugs could be very expensive, and if very badly chosen on whim or an individual choice not always scientific, that much more money could be spent on drugs than needed to be. So when Dr. Frank Ramsey, later Sir Frank Ramsey, took over as head of this putative National Health Service, he heavily promoted and argued for the development of the drug service. A Canadian who was a military man, a former military man with a very military approach, came down as the head initially, and he was replaced ultimately by Mr. Lennox Prescott as head of the drug service. And a National Drug Formulary Committee was established to select drugs. And what we did was to follow the essential drug policies of the World Health Organization. But what that meant was that Dr. Jones and Dr. Smith and Dr. Brown couldn't necessarily get the drug that they had been using for 20 years because there was a drug that made more sense, that had a better scientific data set, and which might actually have been cheaper. And then we went for a lot of drugs which could be safely made by generic companies. And that upset people who were familiar with the trade name. And I take this opportunity to say that the trade name Panadol for an analgesic, a painkiller, is known to most people who find it an easier name to say Panadol than to say paracetamol, which has 5 syllables. But paracetamol is the generic or scientific name, and Panadol is the trade name of the drug which first developed and promoted it. But it cost a great deal more than the generic version. Many of the doctors were almost rioting, they were rebelling, they were protesting loudly. And Sir Frank Ramsey actually organized seminars inviting doctors for me to talk to them and explain the whole business of generic versus patented trade names and the issues of quality which were important in selecting drugs, and why we didn't need to have a range of 12 drugs that did the same thing. Because if you're buying 10 different drugs, obviously you're going to pay a higher cost than if you're buying 100 of one drug.
Quite interesting. Food for thought. In our next episode, Sir Henry shall continue his reflections on patient care. This has been Sir Henry Fraser, His Life in Focus. I'm Miles Eversley. Do take care and thanks for your time.